Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in another WEFI seminar. And today we're very, very happy to have Jorge Guzman from Colombia to talk about entrepreneurial migration. And we're also having Jorge's co-author, Bryan, on the call. And you know all the ground rules. By far, I think that is, we're going to have 40 minutes for the presenter, and you can put in questions in the chat, but Jorge will also perhaps pause in the middle to invite any clarification type of questions. And then we're going to have 15 minutes for our discussant. Today we have Cameron LaPoint from Yale to discuss the paper. And Jorge, why don't you take it away?
Thank you. Thanks. Let me share my screen here. So thank you, Song and Michael and the rest of the organizers for including our paper today. I'm really excited, and Kevin is also really excited to share this paper with you. And thank you to Cameron for all the comments. This is, Kevin's is here. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, and he'll get to them. Or I'll try to stop in a couple places, but definitely take that as your first option and keep them coming. I think it really kind of makes a conversation a lot more lively to get a lot of questions in the chat. Okay, so let me talk about entrepreneurial migration today by starting with a couple of stories. This is Christian Chabot. Now, Christian Chabot is a successful graduate of Stanford, graduate to Stanford GSB, and after finishing his MBA, he decided to start a company. He realized there was sort of a boom in data and an ability to kind of visualize that, but the current business intelligence tools were not that great. And so he said, I'll start a company doing business intelligence software as a service. Its name is Tableau. It's actually been pretty successful so far. What's interesting is that Christian Chabot, once he kind of started going on with his company, he decided to move out of the Stanford area and go somewhere else. He decided to move to Seattle, Washington. And of course, it was sort of an interesting pattern. And the media asked him, well, why did you do that? And he had a simple answer. He said, Seattle, it's just a great city. It's clearly no Silicon Valley in terms of sheer volume of technology companies, but it's respectable. And so, in that, I think there's sort of a little bit of an amenities coming to that. While Silicon Valley is nice, Seattle's just a kind of a better place to live at least for Christian in this case. Here's a second story, Discussant Animal Health. This was created by Diana Wood in a suburb in Portland, Oregon. It was a VC-backed company focused on pharmaceuticals for pets, right? So, as you know, it's a booming market as we're all kind of being more concerned about the health of our pets. And she decided to also move from Portland, Oregon to Kansas City, Kansas. And she was attracted by a booming sort of ecosystem. And so when they asked her, she said, the culture in Kansas City, the culture of Kansas City and concentration of animal health companies here made it actually quite easy for me. There's no place like the Kansas City Animal Health Corridor for a company looking to serve the animal health industry. And so her comment seems sort of a lot more hinting to something like a local cluster effect, agglomeration, sort of good inputs were there for her in her kind of industry in the Kansas City Animal Health Corridor. Here's a third one just to finish. This is Ginger.io. This is a company that was born out of MIT in 2010. I remember when I was at MIT, I knew Karen, and they were pretty successful working at MIT. They were like in Techstars Boston. Eventually, they decided to move out of Boston and move to sort of the Bay Area. And the reason there, even though they were leaving all their advisors at MIT, et cetera, was actually kind of idiosyncratic. The Bay Area was a great cluster, but really Karen's fiance was a doctor, and she had just been admitted for residency at the University of California, San Francisco. And if you're familiar with the medical residency system in the US, basically you get assigned one place, and wherever you're admitted, you just have to go. There's no kind of option around that. So his fiance was going, and he kind of followed her, pretty idiosyncratic sense. And so, when we see these three examples, it seems like sort of there's a little bit this idea of entrepreneurial migration. There's at least some startups that appear to be moving from their founding location to other destinations. In these three examples that I told you, each move at an early sort of entrepreneurial stage. It's not like they succeeded in one place and then expanded. And the reasons appear kind of varied, at least in these three examples. There's amenities, there's something about personal productivity, they're idiosyncratic, and you can think about other things like taxes, etc. And so our purpose of this paper, building from these three examples, is to study this idea of entrepreneurial migration. Does it happen? How often does it happen? And then more interestingly, where are they going? So what cities are attracting startups, and sort of what characteristics of cities can predict that they're attractive to startups. And so just to give you a sense of where we're going, we're going to use data, we're going to use business registration records, and the incidence of cross-state registration of Delaware firms, right? So we're going to look at business registration records. I'll tell you a lot about this in just a second, but they are sort of the document that you create when you start a company. If you have a corporation, there's a physical thing you have to do, which is register that corporation. And we're going to use the fact that they register across states and to kind of document the migration of the startup principal executive office. Using that, we'll document three facts. 6.6% of startups migrate across state lines within 6 years of founding. Many important startup hubs, we found this pretty startling, appear to lose more startups than they gain, right? So we will not see the big winners be Boston and the Bay Area, et cetera. And, we're actually finding a strong correlation between migration and personal income taxes, as well as other things. Now, building from these three facts, we're going to build a model. We're going to build a model of location choice that just doesn't look at sort of where to, net movers to one place that total moves in or moves out, but it's actually going to model the full graph of location choices from sort of the points in the graph we're able to see. That allows us to use sort of the revealed preference of startups moving to different places to try to estimate the underlying utility that migrants have for each destination. Now, there's sort of like, I'll explain a lot about it in just a second, but if you're familiar with Sorkin 2018, where he uses these to look at how employees move from one company to another, if you're familiar with Google PageRank, where they look at a graph of kind of websites connecting to each other, it's sort of very related between those two, though obviously kind of our own flavor of that. Then we will get to the questions I mentioned, which cities attract startups. So we'll give you ranking of the cities. We're going to estimate the utility of migrants for cities. We'll show you a ranking for both two types of startups, kind of more growth-oriented startups, Delaware corporations, and slightly less growth-oriented Delaware LLCs. And finally, we're gonna use city characteristics and how they correlate. It's not causal, right? It's just how they correlate to these startup migrant utilities. We will find migrant utilities sort of correlated to, sort of consistent with a few theories. Migrants appear to move to places high in amenities, low in personal income taxes, and as well as kind of nursery cities. They leave these kind of some locations that have a lot of local ideas, such as college towns. We're not going to find a lot of correlations that would be consistent with a Marshalian industry structure, so very specialized cities, as well as something about ecosystem strength. So let me so I'll jump to tell you all about that. And let me just, before I'll stop for a question in just a second, let me tell you about our data first. So as I said, just so you get a sense of how we're thinking about this, we use business registration records. Now, for some of you may have a sense of what this is, but just to go through it again, registering a business, like there's a real thing you have to do in the process of creating a high growth company for, virtually all high growth companies in the US. It's, you can imagine some very complicated corporate way to do this, but essentially all kind of growth oriented firms in the US, one very simple thing they need to do is eventually, but kind of pretty early on in the process, they need to register the company as a corporation, as an LLC, or a partnership. From a legal sense, it is indeed the act of registering this company that creates the business. And so most growth-oriented startups, now, when you register in the US, there's sort of this thing. Actually, let me show you this. So, this is, in the state of Massachusetts, there's kind of this building where you go and file these paperwork, and there's a similar one in each state. Now, one thing that is pretty unique feature about the US is that rather than having one individual jurisdiction across the country, each state has its own kind of corporate law jurisdiction that is somewhat independent. And through some historical reasons that, it's a lot of fun, yet we won't have time to get into. Delaware, the state of Delaware, turns out to be the kind of preferred state of registration for a large chunk of growth-oriented companies. And so, for example, Delaware companies are only 3% of all firms, but they're more than 50% of all public firms. And firms registered in Delaware sort of are 23 times more likely to get an equity exit and 30 times more likely to be venture capital. The kind of idea is that, Delaware, it's very, there's a big corporate law history on that. If you have any questions about how your case is going to go, there's history about that. And VCs and, public contracts, et cetera, they're really made to work under Delaware corporate law. So there's kind of tendency to go to that jurisdiction. However, if you register in Delaware, you're still required to register in your local state. In any state in which you kind of do meaningful business activities. So if you're in Boston and you're, I don't know, a startup like Ginger.io that I mentioned, then you have to go and say, well, we're a company from Delaware, kind of registering in Boston to start to sort of do business here. Here's, for example, the registration of a popular company today, Moderna, also registered, this one registered in Delaware in 2009. We see the street, we see a few things here. We see that but this is the filing in Massachusetts, and we see that, it has a street address in Massachusetts that is sort of One Memorial Drive, and sort of that which turned out to be this incubator where they grew. You will also see the president and the directors, and for example, you see here Derek Grossi, who was the chief scientist developing what is today sort of the vaccine for COVID, as well as Bob Langer, a famous kind of serial entrepreneur tied to MIT. Just so you get a sense, right? And so what we're going to do is not use all companies, but really use these Delaware companies that are a lot more kind of growth oriented. Here, this gives you a sense that we may be capturing the right thing. When we look at Delaware corporations and we do, for example, a ranking of corporations per population, we do get sort of a ranking that looks pretty consistent with our sense of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the location with the most Delaware corporations per capita is San Jose, then Bridgeport, then San Francisco, then Boulder, Boston, Durham, LA, Miami, etc., Austin, San Diego. And so it does seem to be that, there's a sense that these Delaware registrations are capturing high growth companies. Now, the next thing is, how would we grab these registrations and measure what we call entrepreneurial migration? So let me show you that. We get you back to Ginger.io, which I mentioned moved. Now, this is the registration in Massachusetts. And we see the same thing that I showed you for Moderna. There's a street address of principal office. There's a street address in the Office of the Commonwealth, which is the same, and the president and vice president, etc. Now, I told you they moved to San Francisco. And so when they moved to San Francisco, this was their registration in California. And you see two things here. First, there's a street address of the principal business office in California. But there's also this street address of the principal executive office. And so what we're going to do is say, look, if you're moving to a different state and changing the street address of your principal executive office, we're going to think of you as a migration. Here's as a counterexample. Here's the California registration for Moderna that I showed you. And as you can see, it continues having, this is in California, but it continues having the principal executive office of record as Massachusetts. So Moderna would not be a migrant, and Ginger.io in this case would be a migrant, which is sort of consistent with reality. We do that for these 34 states, so we're not able to capture these kind of detailed re-registration in all states, but we do it for 34 states, accounting for 82% of US population. And we're sort of going to assume that this change of principal office means a migration of the headquarters. We do confirm a lot of these by comparing. I showed you that we also see the addresses of the directors. We do see in many places that directors, where we have the data, we see that directors also move and validate that way, that this measure is really capturing a relocation of the business activity, and it's just not just some domicile thing for sort of any reason that you might think of. Though it's fair to say that a lot of these reasons are not that useful because they're nonetheless in Delaware jurisdiction, so neither of Massachusetts nor California is that jurisdiction for example, Ginger.io. Okay, So let me stop here to see if anybody has questions on the data. Okay.
I think you're
I don't
good
see
to go.
anything meaningful, so you can go.
Okay. Let me keep going then. All right, so that's our data. Now you have a sense. We're looking, I missed the timeline, sorry. We're looking 1988 to 2016. And this is data that I've also used in something called the Startup Cartography Project, but that's the data. And so now you have a sense of what kind of registrations we're looking at. This is the summary statistics. So we have 181,000 corporations and 237,000 LLCs. Now, 5.6% of corporations move in 5 years in our data, but of course, as I showed you, there's sort of these missing states where we could also have some migrants going from this source location to our destination states. And so we try to sort of, estimate how much it would be for these missing states. We do a pretty simple regression by just kind of putting population and population growth between pairs of states, trying to estimate how much would be missing. Our estimates kind of suggest that we'd be missing about 1% extra. And so we sort of have an estimate of within these 5 years, we observed 6.6% of Delaware corporations moving and 3.2% of LLCs. Just so you have a sense of, is this big, is this small, we don't know. 8% of individuals around this time period move across states within 5 years. And so it's a little bit lower, but not that far off from the usual kind of individual cross-state migration rate. Okay, now we see these migration rate drop over time. We just show obviously here until 2010 because we're not able to see the full window of 5 years for later migrants. And we see it for all firms. We see it just for corporations. When we look at some sort of like really high quality firms with different types of IP, we also see it dropping over time. This is also consistent, the interstate migration rate has been dropping over time across a range of populations. Now, here's what we think is more interesting. This is fact 2 that I was telling you. When we plot sort of the local log number of Delaware startups by population, with a simple proxy of how attractive you are, which could be the sort of the number of companies you receive, the ratio of number of companies you receive divided by how many companies you lose, we actually found them to be pretty uncorrelated. At the top here, you see what I told you, these basically kind of high growth ecosystems. There's San Francisco and San Jose and Boston and Boulder and LA and San Diego and Bridgeport. At the left, you see a bunch of locations that they're not that bad in their local level of entrepreneurship, but they're pretty unattractive for migrants. Cincinnati, Burlington, Vermont, Albany, the Albany area, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Jackson, Missouri. These seem, to me also, it seems consistent with my own intuition of places that startups are relatively unlikely to move. Like Burlington is well known to have a lot of innovation, but it's true that it's hard to think that a startup would move to Vermont as it's thinking of what to do. Now, on the right here, we see the opposite. We see places that appear pretty valuable to as destinations, even if they don't have some ridiculous amount of local entrepreneurship. And that seems to be more like Naples, Florida, and sort of Tennessee, and Tucson, Arizona, and Houston, Texas. And so we're already starting to see that these things are very different. And you're already starting to get this sense that, yes, it's Texas and Arizona and places in the South and things like that, but we're really gonna kind of push that to get deeper into why. Okay, and I told you about taxes. Here's the overall correlation of kind of the same thing, moves in, moves out, versus taxes. Now, the obvious reason you don't just want to do what we did here with moves in divided by moves out is that you sort of want to think, well, we would like to value more migrants leaving relatively valuable places. What does that mean? Well, if you move out of, suppose Silicon Valley is an attractive place. If you move out of Silicon Valley and instead choose Topeka, Kansas, then that must be sort of a stronger signal of the value of Topeka than if you move sort of from a place that is not very good to another place that is not very good. And that's kind of, but it's still, if you look at this graph of cities, right? So we sort of think about that, and we develop a graph of cities by state-to-state flows or CBSA to CBSA flows. It's not easy to do that because actually, 46% of states pairs in our data never have a migrant between them, and 95% of city pairs in terms of MSA to MSA also never have a migrant between them, one of these cross-state migrants. And so that's why we're going to kind of bring it into a model to then think, how can we extract the value of a city, how, to migrants? How can we go beyond this while having these? We do have a connected matrix, so sort of every city has some migrants to other cities or from other cities, but we don't have, but it's still pretty sparse. And so how can we use these to extract the value of cities for migrants? And so let me tell you what we do there. Okay, so and what we're going to do, as I said, it's this Google PageRank idea. It's building on Sorkin's rebuild preference approach. And there's sort of the very basic idea. I'll actually show you the model in just a second. Is this kind of transitivity property, as I said. If B here is a very popular destination where everybody's going, and D here is an unpopular destination nobody goes to, sort of we would interpret this as C being sort of a little bit more valuable because kind of companies from popular places are going to C, even if in this case, imagine it loses one and gains one, we sort of want to weight that by kind of the popularity of different places. Okay, well, let me actually show you how we do that because I think it's really interesting. So the world is n potential entrepreneurs getting utility draws from every city. The utility draw is sort of this BJ, which is a common utility for founders for each city, and this mu J, which is an idiosyncratic utility that each founder has that is different for each city. We also allow not everybody here has to be a founder. They also have a B0 and a mu0, which is their preference for starting or not starting a firm. So there's n people, but not everybody starts a firm, and they have different utilities for each city. So what we're trying to do here is there's some on-model reason for the distribution of cities that includes both mean effects for city, founder people's own preference for cities, and where they start off. Now, some of these founders are going to think about migration. And so with some probability delta, they're going to consider moving. When they consider moving, they're not going to move based on those Bs that I just showed you, but rather based on some new utility value, V plus epsilon ij. And so Vj is the common utility to migrants, sort of the mean of these benefits they see in new cities when they're sort of, they're founded and now they're thinking about whether to move. And epsilon ij is sort of an idiosyncratic level. Some people may move because there's clear benefits that everybody can see. That's sort of the Seattle is a great city effect. But some people, that's just where their partner is, like we talked about Ginger.io. And so maybe that's why they would choose to move. So there's some common component and some idiosyncratic component. This is what the quantity we're going after, VJ bar, which is the relative utility, right? So it's sort of how migrants think about kind of places to move relative to the place where they are born. And I sort of, what I would show you is that you can actually extract this V bar J based on the, without actually having to know either N, the total number of entrepreneurs, or the value of being entrepreneur V0, or how likely they are to consider moving delta. And so all of these parameters that are obviously important in choice are kind of drop off based on how we model this. Okay, so who moves? Well, the number of firms choosing to move from CDJ to K, we'll call that MJK, and it's sort of total number of firms plus the number that start a city in J plus delta, who thinks about moving, and between the movers, the set that actually prefers to move, that which to the destination K, which is based on VK. And so I mentioned these error terms are IID extreme value 1, and so that means that we can model these as a discrete choice problem, and it looks like this. Now, what we're going to think about is we're going to think about the ratio of moves, sort of two between a pair in one direction and the other. And so this is kind of MJK divided by MKJ, and you see that it sort of came out to this relationship, MJK WJ, where WJ is the value for migrants for CDJ, should equalize MKJ over WK. All right, so once we have all pairs, so that's the formula that I have here highlighted. Once we have all pairs, we're just gonna sum over J, get to this formula here at the bottom, and then put it in matrix form, which gets us to SW, where W is sort of these vectors should equal W. And this is, I think, the most exciting, the kind of more coolest part to me of the paper is that if you use something called the Peron-Frobenius theorem, and S is strongly connected, that means that sort of you don't have to be connected to every city, but you need to be at least connected to some city. There exists a unique largest eigenvalue equal to 1, and you can extract these utilities analytically. And so again, sort of all of these I show you, we can actually extract the utilities that kind of, well, a sort of normalized value of these V bar J, right, which is what I had for you over here, based on just looking at the graph and kind of extracting the eigenvalue. That was a lot, and so I'm curious. Let me take a second stop here, Kevin, if you think there's anything we should look at, or if anybody wants to raise their hand. We still have like 12 minutes, so I think we're doing well on time.
Yeah, Kevin, I see that you're being active in responding to things and so on, but if you think there's anything that you want to like discuss openly a little bit, because not everybody is looking at the chat, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, Jorge can continue.
Yeah, I think we're good. You can find more details of the model in the paper, but if you think from a normal urban economics standpoint, what we're really trying to avoid is having to pre-specify the covariates that matter for startups who move, because just in principle, I have no idea what they could be. And like when we look at anecdotal stories of firms moving, there's so many different things that like you would never include in a regression. That any type of regression you try to do is just going to be biased by those emitted variables. So we wanted to start with a pure ranking that was just purely based on revealed preference. And it turns out using these tricks that Sorkin came up with in a labor context with a slight modification, you can do that.
All right, cool. Thank you. All right, so we do all this and we do extract, as I mentioned, these analytical utilities of cities. And so we can actually rank cities and see which cities appear based on these utilities to be more or less attractive for migrants, right? And so, the other thing I just want to mention, this method also does not require we observe all connections if some are missing. For example, even though there's migrations from LA to San Francisco that are within state, and we're looking at cross-state migrations, well, cross-state different MSA migrations, our method also allows us to extract that, to extract the common utility value, even if some of these individual kind of connections are missing. Okay, so city rankings for Delaware corporations, what do we get? These are the top cities with more than 1 million people. We get a little bit, we're starting to get this idea that I showed you in this scatter plot. At the top, we get Dallas, Phoenix, Austin, Charlotte, Houston, Seattle. These seem to be, it's interesting. They are different from for example, the ranking, as I mentioned, the ranking of Delaware corporations per capita that I showed you, as well as rankings of, for example, VC per capita. But they're pretty consistent with what I'm seeing in the news. I mean, Hewlett Packard, so I show you here 3 top places: Dallas, Phoenix, Austin. And if anybody has been keeping up with the news, Tesla is saying it's moving its headquarters to Austin. Hewlett Packard's moving its headquarters to Texas. Now, I know those are kind of larger, more established firms than the startups we're looking at, but it does seem to be kind of hinting at some sort of underlying similar force. And as well as to Phoenix, if you're building a startup, this is one essay, right? If you're building a startup, you need to move to Phoenix, not Silicon Valley. Indeed, they appear to be not only on our data, but kind of based on some news media you can look at, actually pretty interesting destinations for movers. Here's the bottom 25. So we have 45 cities with over 1 million people in our data. At the very bottom, you really find those cities that I think most of us would agree are relatively undesirable, right? Rochester, New York, Buffalo, New York. Those are places that are in the kind of traditional Rust Belt, and Rochester, New York still has a lot of innovative capacity in it, but it's hard to think that companies would actually move from other locations to there. New Orleans, which has been kind of suffered a lot. It's easy to see that a lot of companies would move out of New Orleans. But here are the startups hubs that I mentioned. You would see that they actually get a lot of moves in. I mean, by total quantity, New York has the highest numbers of moves in into the city, but it has even more moves out, right? So it's 615 moves in, but 1,038 companies are founded in New York and end up moving out of New York over time in our data. San Jose, Boston, San Francisco. Here's Inc. magazine again. Why are more entrepreneurs are moving away from major US startup hubs? The trend lines show that more founders are seeking opportunity outside Silicon Valley and New York City. And so, it's not like this is a very detailed analysis in Inc. magazine, but it's comforting to see that, these views on the ground are actually matching this type of analysis well. Okay. Now, I told you that these are the corporations sort of really growth oriented. For example, if you're getting VC or any type of investor, you have to be a corporation. You cannot be anything else. But if you're hoping to IPO, you have to be a corporation. Now, let me tell you about the LLCs, which are slightly less growth oriented. And here's our ranking. And you see a little bit of some differences, right? You see Jacksonville, Florida, Tampa. There's still the Austin and the Phoenix, but Nashville seems to have moved up. Miami seems to have moved up. Orlando now makes it into ranking. San Antonio. And so these are places. So what I see, my own kind of sort of personal interpretation is that there's some of these places are not well known to be huge startup hubs, but they are well known to be very livable cities. Sort of places that one would, Jacksonville, Florida, and sort of San Diego is obviously a very livable city. It also moved up relative to the ranking before, as well as sort of Tampa, Riverside, Austin, etc. Okay, so maybe sort of if you think about a model where people sort of balance livability and startup success, sort of maybe they're valuing a little bit more of that. Okay, so with these rankings, though, we have these left column that I show you, our log utility, and so we're going to do some cross sections. Again, this is not causal. Just some cross sections. What does this correlate to if it's not sort of the local number of corporations per capita? And I'm just going to show you some things. Now, we tried to structure this into a few theories based on broad kind of, as Kevin mentioned, broad urban economics theories of agglomeration. And so, you can think about Marshall. So, try to see what would be the prediction of Marshall. Well, our view of Marshall is that Marshall would predict that companies would move to locations that have more industry specialization. And so even if you're moving away from San Francisco, maybe you're like we saw in that Kansas City animal health corridor, it's really specialized in this narrow area. And so that would allow, that would be a good thing over time. If you think about Jacobs is kind of the opposite. It's about diversity and the potential for idea generation. Nursery cities, if you follow that, it's sort of, you generate ideas initially, but eventually you move to more specialized places. A sort of entrepreneurial ecosystems view, which is just, Kevin sometimes called it Silicon Valley is eating the world, which is just everybody's going where the VC is. Everybody's going where all the other startups are. Then there's amenities, there's a theories about bohemia and personal income taxes. So personal income tax, I already showed you like one correlation. So let me show you some of these relationships. Again, we're not doing like all variables. We're just looking at sort of cross sections of our estimated utilities, one variable at a time. But here's what we find for some of the first things I show you. The HHI of the industry, sort of if you think that's a specialization, that is negatively correlated to utility. One thing that is really strongly negatively correlated to utility is this idea of the share of higher education students, right? So this is sort of college towns. College towns lose a lot of the startups. Burlington, Vermont's a good example of that. And they do not gain many. Overall, we find these, maybe it's consistent with nursery cities, this piece of college towns, but it's not as consistent because they're not going to these highly specialized clusters. Rather, it seems to be more mixed. Here's the ecosystems view that I told you. Again, it seems to be, maybe there's some of that corporations bursts do kind of correlate to utilities. The amount of venture capital, we don't see that, it's sort of super weak and not significant. the number of LLC birds per pop is also not correlated. For LLCs, for sort of these less growth-oriented migrants, they does seem to correlate a lot more. So maybe the ecosystem matters more for them. We're not sure. We're this is sort of very descriptive based on the relationships we're finding. So Kevin notes in the chat, and this is a good point, that the share of higher ed students, the college town result, is actually a little bit interesting. It's a little bit worrying because a lot of these universities are really investing in doing spin outs, commercializing technology, incubating technology. And if they're losing a lot of those, that's sort of a pattern that creates regional inequality in its own right. Okay, now these are all things that benefit startups and their productivity, but there's also things that benefit founders that are not related to the startup productivity and, for example, amenities. And it's, the theory there is pretty simple. We all like to live a nice life, and so maybe we just like to live in nice places. Okay, so let me show you what we have there. We actually find a strong relationship of a lot of amenity values, mostly for the less growth-oriented one, not for the corporation. So maybe that's because that's what you would expect, right? Because people are kind of trading this thing up. But for example, the more kind of heating days are days where you have to turn on your heating. Migrants don't seek those places. They like places, they correlate with places with sunshine that are close to the water, lower latitudes, with higher average home values. So, right, so remember, in urban economics, we look at average home value as the value of amenities. Places with higher average home values, they're nice places to live. This is when we put a quality of life index, which is this thing developed by David Albuy. And even when we look at Bohemia, which is just the share of Bohemians in this kind of Bohemian culture, a la Richard, Florida, all those things do predict utility for LLCs. And so let me get to our last theory. I think we're doing well on time. Okay, so the last one is taxes, right? Taxes. Now, this is like a little bit more mundane, but actually, when you think about what has empirical, robust evidence in the economics and entrepreneurship literature, the economics and innovation literature, what we have is really robust evidence that taxes matter, at least for inventors. And so here are two great papers by sort of a bunch of my heroes, and they show that for the international mobility of inventors, as well as migration within US states, the cost of the personal income tax actually would shape the choices quite a bit. And this makes sense, right? There's the difference in corporate income tax, on personal income tax can be quite a bit depending on where you are. And so people may be sensitive to that. And so here we find correlations that are a lot more significant. I also think they're sort of pretty consistent because of course, if you look at personal income taxes seem to matter. Now they matter for the corporations. It is the income tax at the really high end, income tax at the 99th percentile of income. Those are the ones that really correlate to this utility. For the LLCs, it's actually more the taxes at the 50th percentile of income that have the strongest correlation. So maybe, that's kind of consistent with expectations on your growth orientation or income and that kind of thing. And so we sort of summarize it at mostly these kind of four theories being consistent. On the agglomeration side, it feels a little bit kind of more sort of on the nursery cities and entrepreneurial ecosystems, it feels a little bit more noisy. And so we find, I think sort of the bottom three sort of show a stronger relationship. Okay, so that's what we have. Let me tell you, we could stop I'll just jump to a conclusion. So what do? We do four things in this paper. I was really excited to share with you guys it's a paper I've been, had tons of fun developing. The first is using the incidence of Delaware registrations across states allows us to document changes in the location of firms' stated principal office. And so I told you about Ginger.io. I told you how they moved to California. And if they had only moved, if they have only done an office expansion, they might have set an address in California in what would be here row number 5. But if they actually move the company to California, then they also change row number 4 here, which is the address of the principal executive office. Now, using that, we find a few things. A startup do not always remain in their home region. 6.6% of high growth corporations move across state to another CDSA. Up to you if you think that's a high number or a low number. It's about kind of the same ballpark of kind of the rate at which people move. The strongest startup hubs. So for that, I show you this, right? I show that the strongest startup hubs are not the most significant destination regions in terms of how many companies they gain versus they look. And sort of here that I show you this correlation, I highlighted that even though the strongest startups hubs are here, sort of the most attractive regions appear to be here to the right. Okay, next, we report new estimates on the value of cities to migrants based purely on the graph of migration choices. And I show you these rankings. They're there in our paper. In our paper, we have a lot of rankings, and they, if you saw regressions, we have sort of the ones for all cities, and those are 183 cities and the relative attractiveness. And finally, there's fixed characteristics of cities that appear to predict these value to migrants, and they seem to be both productivity enhancing and personal benefits. There's stuff about taxes, there's stuff about what looks like culture, right? In this kind of index of Bohemia, there's stuff about quality of life, there's kind of these ecosystems and nursery cities effects. How these covary with value also appears sensitive to firm orientation. So for the more growth-oriented corporations, it seems like certain things predict more in contrast to the LLCs. Okay, so that's all I had. I think I went 1 minute over time, and if so, I'm so sorry. But there's your email address. We'd love your thoughts or anything else. But I'll look forward to Cameron's thoughts.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jorge. And as you will see, there are a lot of interesting discussions on chat as well. But before we go into any of that, we're very happy to have Cameron LaPoint from Yale today to discuss the paper, and take it away.
Great. So thanks to Mike and Song for inviting me to discuss this, and to Jorge and Kevin for writing it. It was a lot of fun to read. So let me just kind of start by recapping the three main stylized facts from this paper. So the first is that we have this headline number of 6.6% of young corporations and 3.2% of young LLCs moving to CBSAs in a new state. So this is kind of like the analog of the 5-year interstate migration rate in the personal migration literature, which I'll kind of recap some facts from that later on. I think the most striking thing from this paper is that well-known hubs like the Silicon Valleys, the Boston, Cambridges, they lose more startups than they gain. And then in terms of what is predicting in the cross-section, these net migration rates, we understand now that personal income tax rates appear to be pretty important. And this is kind of pivoting off of a robust literature in econ, which shows that these state level tax changes are potentially important for migration decisions of individuals as well. At a high level, I think this has some implications for how we build models of firm and labor sorting. So the first is this there's a well-known fact that most startups are founded in a small handful of cities. And this is usually modeled as like there's some sort of location fundamental, or like productivities are distributed across locations in a particular way that makes them birth more firms, or more people just kind of start there. What I think is more interesting, again, the fact that we get some cities are really good at attracting entrepreneurs suggests that these models that have idiosyncratic preferences for sorting, those are kind of invalidated to some extent. So I think in terms of how we build urban models, those are kind of two facts that help us discipline those models. So my comments are going to be focused mostly on, given these three facts, what are kind of the mechanisms behind them? And I think a lot of these things were already touched on in the chat and in the talk today. So think of it almost as like a reframing of what we learned. So first, I think it's useful to go over like who are the startups in this paper. I have a little bit of a pessimistic view, and I understand that there's a huge data challenge here. It seems like it was Herculean to construct all this information, this cartography project, but we don't really know who these firms are. We know that they're young, so they were founded less than 5 years ago. It does include spinouts and subsidiaries of existing firms. We have pretty wide coverage, 36 states. We miss a few large states like Pennsylvania, Michigan. They're growth oriented in the sense that they're Delaware registered firms. We exclude holding companies. And we have kind of 25 years of data. So we're covering, the .com VC boom as well. And it seems from the chat that the authors have split up the sample, and they get, kind of this amenity channel, and taxes still are important for predicting the city utility index in different subperiods. Ideally, though, we'd like to know things about the factor inputs, the industry classification. I think the best you might be able to do is like fuzzy merge the name string to something like Dun & Bradstreet, and then that would allow you to pick up employment, sales volume. I think they also have the CEO or the manager, and then the manager's title. So that might help you a little bit, but I don't know how good that merge is going to be. And you might be able to stick in like a multi-office firm dummy for the firms that have several addresses listed. But again, it's not clear whether that's going to be a true office or whether it's like a work from home office like we have during, like we all do during COVID now. They mentioned this taxonomy of theories. I'm going to kind of lump these together in the interest of keeping it short, but they have this kind of agglomeration externalities matter idea, which has really been emphasized a lot in trade and urban. This nursery cities idea that actually it's the firms want to go to more diverse in terms of industry spaces. And then, what I think gets a lion's share of the attention in this paper is this amenities / bohemia / taxes. And this is basically bread and butter 1970s style urban sorting. People just go to the areas that have the highest amenity adjusted real wage. And so there's three components there. There's the amenity vector, there's how much it costs to live or do business there, and then there's the nominal wage itself. And that would include, net of any income taxes. Let me throw out a few possibilities that weren't really mentioned. One is kind of the financing scheme. Beyond VCs, we know that most of these firms are probably not VC funded. And there's a growing body of evidence, using credit registry data. Here's just one paper that I thought was nice from Bank of England, showing that a lot of young firms are actually using the founder's personal residence as collateral to get that initial bank loan. So, this is kind of a negative statement. Why might you not want to migrate? Well, we know that there's relationship lending. My collateral value might be tied to the performance of the firm very explicitly through the founder's balance sheet. So, and I'll suggest in just a second how you might get at that. Second thing, for multi-office firms, we might worry about span of control costs. A growing trade literature is worried about this. I think these are mostly small firms, so this may not be such a big issue. But if we're thinking about kind of span of control and work from home, I think this is becoming kind of a growing issue, and I'll touch on that in just a second. But I think broadly speaking, this is mostly consistent with entrepreneurs caring about taxes and weather, and some combination of those two things. Let me highlight how you might get at, in a reduced form way, this financing channel. So this is an interesting paper by Thomas Drexel and co-authors, who's at UMD. So here what they're arguing is that state top income shares are actually predictive of small firm hiring. And the reason is that most banks are relying on liquid deposits to make loans to small businesses. And so what they find in this paper is that because high income individuals tend to hold a lot of assets and private value assets and equities, and not put their money in just sitting in their bank account, high income inequality leads to lower bank deposits, which leads to lower credit extended to small firms. So you might be able to just use their Bartik IV or just state top income shares as a reduced form proxy for this. It also means that some of the tax rate variation you're picking up is probably picking up some of the financing environment already. Just kind of touching on span of control, this is like, during the work from home era, there have been a lot of managerial surveys, and managers are concerned about, how do they monitor the performance of their direct reports? And this has actually led to a lot of employers installing institutional spyware on computers to try and log what are people actually doing with their time on work computers. So I think, even for small firms, you might still have these kind of span of control problems by, if you basically move too far away from an existing office, this might be a force against net migration for some areas. So I wonder if you might look at whether the distance between any statewide or CBSA pairs would matter for these migration decisions, kind of in a gravity model sense in trade. Okay, so that's kind of like a few quick things you can do. Let me now run through the main comments. One is this personal versus corporate income tax base. As far as I can tell, I think you're doing everything with personal income tax variation. There's a comment in the chat about capital gains tax variation at the state level. That could be important too, to the extent that there's some sort of carried interest compensation scheme for these firms. Obviously, you don't know that. You don't know the tax filing status. I think you might just check whether you get similar variation for corporate income tax rates, especially because the LLCs can choose, in many cases, whether they file as pass-through entities or whether they want to file as a corp. And different states have different rules about how they tax partnerships, et cetera. But for the most part, there is kind of this dichotomy between corporate and personal income tax bases. Here's just the maps. I won't show you. I'll leave them to you to see from Tax Foundation later. But you can get all the corporate income tax rates from Tax Foundation or MBR TaxSim or Fagelbaum and Zidar's papers. I think they have that as a download as well. So just kind of a restatement of the author's data. So here, I think, separating the LLCs from the corporates is useful for kind of decomposing, how much do individuals care about amenities versus pecuniary benefits. So if I look at the correlation between the index rank for LLCs versus corporates, it's very high, it's like 0.47. But there's some very striking differences in that, the California cities all rank really low for the corporates, but really high for the LLCs. And so this is not consistent with taxes because we know that whatever tax base you're looking at, California has a very high tax regime. So this to me already suggests that LLCs we think of as people and corporates we think more of as profit maximizing firms. So I wonder if, that's kind of my next comment. I wonder if you can kind of say something about whether these are people or firms moving and just, replace your language of like growth oriented as corporate with the corporates are actually more like firms. And then the non-growth oriented or LLCs are actually more like people and reflect the preferences of the founders more directly. Again, like the personal interstate migration literature, it's kind of a mess. I think because the 2010 census doesn't have questions on 5-year migration rates anymore for some reason. So we don't really know what the migration rate is, which is kind of like, okay, this seems like a really important thing that we should know. But as far as I can tell, you're getting a very similar number to what's been reported in some policy reports. And I think in a parallel trade urban literature, if these are people or firms moving, the sorting condition is going to be different. You're either maximizing something that is contingent on an amenity vector, or you're maximizing profits net of these kind of logistical costs. Again, I think the best thing you might be able to do to separate the people from the firms is try to merge the name string with some registry that allows you to pick up some individual details. But I'm not sure how easy that's going to be for you. One quick crosstab I did, and which I think you could do a more robust exercise of, is I took the Alboy Quality of Life Index from his Restat paper. In your paper, I think you're using the Total Quality of Life Index from Alboy, which has pecuniary and non-pecuniary stuff lumped together. If I just take the non-pecuniary component of that index and I crosstab these are all correlations in these cells, you'll see that basically the LLCs, it's all loading on the non-pecuniary component. So they don't really seem to care about wages net of taxes at all. It seems to just be like these people want to live in nice places. So I think you could do that, adjusting for the geographic differences between MSAs and CBSAs a little bit more carefully. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. But my final comment is a little bit more of a technical thing. I don't think you mentioned this in the talk, but inherent in your model, you have this assumption that there's basically no industrial sorting on the migration decision, or put another way, that the errors in the entrepreneur's utility are not correlated across cities. So I think you then need that people aren't sorting to these locations because there's some sort of like industry clustering going on, if I understood that correctly. So you have some test of this where you regress your utility index on an employment Herfindahl, and you get that basically there isn't any relationship there. So that seems to be good news for you. But I'm wondering if that's really the best test of this. Like, I would think that these firms are much more intangible capital intensive. They don't really have much stuff or physical labor. I think maybe you could do this with patents. Probably that would be time consuming. But census also has at least the state level, these stratified industry shares by ownership, and by ownership I mean like whether it's a pass-through or not, and by the size of the workforce. So I think that might be kind of a rough way of doing this a little bit more carefully. And then I kind of viewed this assumption as like you're taking as given that agglomeration doesn't matter, and that's fine. But then I wonder if starting the paper with like, okay, Marshallian externality theory is like the best way to kind of frame this, because I didn't really expect agglomeration to matter to start with, if these are really kind of small, not so capital and labor intensive firms. So my final thoughts, I think this is a super interesting take on early firm life cycle decisions. I think we can kind of almost think of this as a quality of life index for startup locations. I think, one way to kind of pivot this would be to test which sorting condition matters for these small firms, whether it's firm maximization or whether it's just founders sorting to places with highest amenity adjusted real wage. And then, one thing I wanted to know more about is just kind of can you decompose, give us like just some headline number that's like, how much do these founders care about pecuniary versus non-pecuniary incentives? And this is really important for policymakers because they can obviously contract on taxes, they cannot contract on weather. So, and then, going forward, like I was just super curious if you extend this to COVID times, how do you explain things like this, where, we see these anecdotes in Wall Street Journal, all these tech founders are buying up these beautiful ranch homes in places like Bozeman, Montana, that no one had ever heard of. So that suggests that the weight has maybe even shifted way more on the non-pecuniary benefits side. So, again, it was like a super interesting read. I think we learned a lot from it. I just kind of want to know a little bit more about the mechanisms, but thanks.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for a very interesting discussion. And now, Jorge, back to you. Do you want to take, or you or Kevin want to take a few minutes to respond, and then we can open to the audience questions a little bit.
I mean, thank you, Cameron. That was really amazing. And it was like, a laundry list of things that now that you've said them, I was like, yes, 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 and yes. So we'll go into all those. I'm excited that you pushed on these people or firms idea. I think, I've thought about it sometimes, and startups are entrepreneurs, and it's actually, they're actually the person is the firm, and so it's actually it's hard to separate between the two, making a choice between the two rather than in the usual kind of old school location choice model. So I think, hopefully Kevin and I can think more about that and keep thinking about those ideas. The rest, this is super useful. I think the idea that, using top income shares, other things that, we'll look into that. We did try a gravity model within movers. So I mentioned just, it's a small number of movers, and there we didn't seem to find a lot, but we can think about it more and think how to incorporate all the pairs that don't have, sort of within pairs that have movers, and we can try to think about it more and see how much it matters. But this was all great, and this COVID question is also super useful. So thank you so much, Kevin. Do you have anything else you want to add?
Oh no, just thanks a lot, Kevin. Really appreciate everyone in the comments. All of your comments are very well taken. I mentioned Jorge is very he doesn't want to brag, but I should point out, like, this data, it's really, really hard to measure quality startups at birth. Like, we just don't have good data on them. The main data sets basically don't have them often for a few years after they're born. And if you saw all of, like, the FOIA requests and all the nonsense that and the many states we've had a fight with that still haven't given us data, it's hopefully more people are interested in this. And if you should definitely talk to Jorge if you find this type of registration data interesting. A lot of it's online already on his startup cartography website.